Hello, everyone, and good evening. It is wonderful to be here, and thank you for UChicago for hosting and for Fiona for being here as well. I am thrilled to have this conversation, and needless to say, it is relevant for all of us because last I checked, 100% of us have to eat to live, so talk about it being close to the heart and stomach. We are going to go on a journey tonight. Lauren talked about how these lectures have been around the world. Well, so has Fiona and her research. We're going to light in places like India and California to really understand and unpack how our food systems are straying under this warming world and a few things that we might be able to do about it. And toward the end, we will get to some questions from you in the audience, so please be thinking of things you'd like to ask. So Fiona, I want to start 30,000 feet. Can you give us a lay of the land? How is our warming world affecting our food systems?
Yeah, absolutely. So I should start by saying I apologize. I'm not a climate scientist. I'm an economist. So that means I'm going to be thinking about these types of questions through a policy lens. But the basic climate science here is the climate is already changing. And some colleagues of mine have been doing a lot of work trying to think about what is the impact of that changing climate on our agricultural system. The headline here is bad news. So for every degree Celsius warming, we're expecting to see about a 4% reduction in overall agricultural production, so the ability to feed our world. But of course, that's very unevenly distributed. So by end of century, under our current climate change projections, we expect massive yield losses in staple crops like rice, corn, soy, sorghum, etc. A lot of climate change impacts actually tend to be concentrated in low-income areas. Here, things look a little different. Actually, the worst of the climate change impacts on agriculture are expected to be felt in the world's breadbaskets. Think about like where the University of Chicago sits in Illinois. But of course, that has major consequences because we trade a lot of that agricultural production, right? So we're expecting to see yield losses of approximately 40% in these global bread baskets, approximately 20% in lower income countries, but to the extent that low income countries consume the food that we and rich nations produce, that causes challenges for us. A big question with those numbers is how much adaptation is going to happen. Those estimates are baking in adaptation. So if you imagine a world without climate adaptation, things look actually dramatically worse.
Well, a bit of a bummer, but I think we can find some positive things here in a moment. But first, a quick raise of hands. Who here has read an article about how climate change is going to make it so we can't drink coffee or wine anymore? Yeah, okay, a few hands have gone up. They're all over the place. And I just kind of want to unpack that really quickly, Fiona. What do those articles mean when it says the coffee supply or the wine supply is going to double away? Is that really true, or is it just more hyperbole from the media?
Yeah, I mean, I think the truth lies somewhere in between, right? I would say that the majority of the really rigorous research on this topic has been focused on these staple crops because that's what the majority of us depend on for our livelihoods. But there is also a large amount of work thinking about these specialty crops like coffee and wine. And basically what you're starting to see is, yes, negative impacts on those crops. Why is that? Well, it's because some of these really high value specialty crops depend on a very particular climate. Right? We're starting to see wine being able to be grown in the UK. That's essentially possible because of climate change. I'm originally from California. Every California producer would tell you you need a perfect blend of soil and climate and rainfall, etc., to grow those perfect grapes. Well, the places around the world that have access to that combination of things is changing and shrinking.
So I guess that's a slight concept, right? We can have some British wine. Yeah, British wine. And that was actually one of the pre-submitted questions was that, can there actually be some positive sides to this agriculture story in a warming world?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, climate change is going to have distributional consequences. What that means is that we're going to see some really negative impacts in some places, again, like where I live in Illinois right now, but other places are really going to benefit. Northern Canada is going to turn into an enormous winner here in terms of climate change and agriculture, because right now it's really too cold to grow most of these breadbasket types of crops. But as things warm, you're going to have the ability for some of these new places to come into profitable growing regions. Of course, that comes with the downside of the places that are growing really well right now. We're going to start getting too hot to do that farming, so that's the trade-off. On net, it looks like we're losing, but there are, of course, going to be some winners from this as well.
Right, and I think it's important to emphasize that although there will be some, there's far more losers than winners. That's one of the most common arguments about climate science is that, oh, well, it's going to be warmer, and in the wintertime, it isn't that great. And so I think that's an important thing to say. Fiona, I want to kind of come back to this idea that lower income countries are going to be hit hardest, and that's going to be a common theme we're going to talk about when we embark on our research journey here in a moment. Can you talk about why that is? And then not to be too insular about it, but why should richer countries care?
Yeah, so I think the way to think about this in terms of agriculture is actually in terms of production overall, we're going to see the biggest declines in wealthier countries. But that you can think about that translating into really large kind of personally felt impacts in low-income countries. Why is that? Because if you're already living on something close to a subsistence diet and now I've reduced your yields by 15%, that's much more harmful for you than it is for me who's like enjoying my American cheeseburger 3 times a week. I don't actually do that, but you could imagine, right? The consequences,
A lot of Americans do.
yeah, and the consequences of these agricultural losses tend to be felt more even if the actual production losses are coming into rich places, sort of where the population is lower income and less of an ability to cook. Then there's a question of why should we care about this? I mean, I think there's a few answers. One is just a standard humanitarian argument, which is there's no reason to think that my life is more valuable than someone who happens to have been born in India. A more practical argument is if we're trying to think about addressing climate change, climate solutions has to involve the developing world by design because a vast majority of emissions over the next century are going to come from low-income countries, right? These are places that are increasing their economic growth dramatically in the status quo, doing so largely powered by fossil fuels. That has climate change impacts on all of us. And so if we want things to change course in those low-income countries, that's really going to take some action on our part in order to help enable some of those changes to happen. We just can't sit around and say, oh, like India, you're being bad, China, you're being bad for emitting, we don't like you. Especially as the US today, it's hard to take that position. But kind of more importantly, when we're thinking about the unequal damages, if someone in India is trying to balance, let me get out of poverty by having the economy grow, versus I have this new challenge of climate change. You need to balance those two things very carefully, and that's where I think the wealthy world can do some things to make that balance much easier and help this kind of climate change transition, green transition happen.
Let's go to India for a little while. So as Lauren mentioned, in addition to my hat at Axios, I am also thrilled to be a fellow at the New Institute at Chicago. And we have our podcast Shocked, which, again, more info in the back. If you're not listening to it, you should. It's a really unique take, narrative format on these issues to try to reach, people who are experts, but people who you probably had Thanksgiving with and people who you'll have Christmas with. These are the people who we want to reach because these things affect all of us. And we had the pleasure of chatting with Fiona for an episode about how AI is helping farmers in India with monsoon forecasts. Harkening back to the Farmer's Almanac, our episode was called the AI Manac, which is a fun little pun. So Fiona, can you take us to India and walk us through this research of what you found?
Yeah, absolutely. So this has been a project I've been excited to work on for the last 4 or 5 years. The starting point of this work was spending time in the field talking to Indian farmers. One thing you hear consistently over and over again is a major challenge they face is figuring out when they should be starting their planting season. The major determinant of whether your growing season is going to be good or bad, and the setting turns out to be when the monsoon rains start to arrive. Right, so India, like much of the world, relies on a monsoonal climate. What that means is you have a wet season, which is where the majority of agricultural production happens, and then you're going to have a dry season as well. So in order to do a good job planting in the wet season, or to have a successful wet season, 2 things need to happen. One is the best seasons happen when that monsoon shows up earlier. Why? Because you tend to have a longer growing season, and that is conducive to some of the more profitable crops. Think like cotton. It also helps rice do much better. But in addition to hopefully having a good season, the other thing is you need to know that that good season is coming. And if you're a smallholder farmer, you're somebody who owns maybe 1 or 2 hectares of land and is really a relatively low income, like this is not major agricultural conglomerates, we should think about smallholders here. Those folks have very limited access to information about when the monsoon is going to arrive. What that means is for us as researchers, we saw a potential opportunity. If we could show up and provide better information about the monsoon, one thing we could help farmers do is tailor their cropping decisions to the coming weather. Think about it this way, at a much smaller scale. If I have a weather app on my phone that tells me, hey, tomorrow is going to rain, I can make sure I bring my umbrella and don't arrive to the office soaked. When I lived in California, that wasn't a problem because it was beautiful all the time. Now I live in Chicago, I have to pay attention to what the weather looks like. The Indian farmer faces the same problem, but on a much larger scale, which is to say their entire outcome of whether their growing season will be good or bad really hinges on, do you plant the right thing? Do you plant at the right time? Do you plant at all? Maybe you could instead do better in a really bad agricultural season by leaving and going to the city rather than staying and working on the farm. Okay, so that's a major decision that you need to make well in advance of when the season actually starts, because you need to have your seeds are ordered, your labor lined up, etc. But making that decision is really, really difficult. When we went and interviewed farmers, one kind of fun piece of anecdote that we learned is that the most popular guy in the village around the time of planting decisions is the local astrologer. Why? Because he claims to have information about when the rain is going to show up. That's really a little questionable. In some places he's okay, but for the most part, not great. But there's a huge demand for that type of information. So what we did in our study was provide farmers with some of the most cutting edge climate science, which is a forecast that can be issued around 4 to 6 weeks in advance that tells farmers when the monsoon is going to arrive. Turns out if you provide farmers with that information, they do exactly what you would expect, which is optimize their growing decisions in line with the information. So if you're a farmer who's expecting it to be a really, really good weather year, you were going to plant a cash crop and you were going to spend all your money on the farm, and then you learn, hey, wait, this is actually a little bit worse than you thought that it was going to be. You can make a decision to say, okay, I'm going to pull a little bit of that cash out of the farm. Instead of investing it all when it's not going to be great weather, I'll spend some of the money kind of outside of the farm and in a different business. On the other hand, if you're somebody who was really pessimistic about the growing season, you thought it was going to be a terrible year, and so you were barely going to bother to plant, and now you learn actually this is going to be a fantastic growing season, now you can go ahead and invest more on the farm. That's exactly what we see. That translates into big changes in farmers' overall investment levels, kind of similar magnitude to giving them an index insurance product, which suggests to us that the simple piece of information, here's when the monsoon is going to begin, is a really powerful tool in the hands of farmers. That doesn't just translate into what they do on the field, but it turns out to affect their kind of overall well-being at the end of the growing season as well. So we see these farmers who had access to the information compared to a control group that we randomized not to receive the forecast. I'm happy to talk about that a little bit further. But the difference between farmers who did get the forecast and those who did not, only due to the impact of the forecast, was a pretty large increase in household consumption. That's a metric of how well households are doing in these low-income settings. Increases of around 7 to 8%. That's a really large improvement, and what that tells you is that farmers were able to take out information and sort of effectively re-optimize. So that was kind of the building block for the initial study that we did.
That's wild. So would you say before you came along, it was literally an astrologist who was giving out weather forecasts?
Yeah, so there are all sorts of interesting sources of weather information. One is the local astrologer. Another one is actually what the anthropologists call ecological signals. You dig into that a little further, and what people are looking for is when do the peacocks start dancing in a particular way? You look for when does the wind move through the trees a little bit differently. You also turn to kind of the government for information. Unfortunately, at least in the recent historical past, the government has actually not provided this particular piece of information. The Indian Meteorological Department has provided other weather information, things the more kind of standard 2-day weather forecast, or some things about how much it's going to rain over the growing season. They actually haven't been providing information about when the monsoon will start, and that was something that kind of came out of us going and doing piloting and initial field-borne with farmers, was that was really a key piece of information that they didn't have access to. I think the long and short of it is the reason that they turn to the astrologer is because they're desperate for this information. They're going to as many sources as they possibly can, and that guy turns out to end up being popular.
Well, hopefully he's not out of a job as an astrologist because of the AI. In our podcast, we use a metaphor to say the government data that India was using is directed at richer countries. And so the metaphor we used in the podcast is basically, it's kind of like if you get hand-me-down clothes that are several sizes too big for you. So I guess not totally useless, but not very helpful. Can you talk about that, and is AI providing fit as needed data for these countries?
Yeah, so in the initial study, we provided actually a non-AI based forecast. This was a kind of physics-based climate model. But one thing that's really exciting is in follow-up years, we've tried to scale this much more extensively. So the first, pilot study was a couple hundred villages. And the year after that, we scaled across the entire state of Telangana. And then this past year, we sent forecast to 40 million farmers. How you do that in a way that produces accurate forecasts? Well, you want to use the most sort of state-of-the-art piece of technology that's possible, and that's increasingly becoming these AI forecasts. So one thing that's kind of interesting about using AI for forecasting is that local meteorologists are really good at producing forecasts of what tomorrow's weather is going to be, or the day after, or the day after. Within a sort of 2-week window, we tend to do actually quite a good job. I don't know how well we do this here in London, but broadly around the world, we tend to do pretty well. There is a big gap between forecast quality in rich countries and in poor countries. That comes from a couple of places. One is the data are just better in wealthier countries. Producing a good forecast relies on intensive weather station input data, and that's just a lot more of those weather stations around the world in wealthy places than in less wealthy places. But the other thing is you require a complicated physics model of how the underlying climate system is moving and how that translates into local experiences. We've just invested a lot more money in that type of thing in the rich world than in the developing world. And so here's where I think there's a really big opportunity for AI. You don't necessarily need teams of hugely extensive physicists and supercomputers. You can now run one of these AI-based forecast models on your own laptop. And that means that there's a lot more opportunity to kind of cheaply tweak these models and make them be a better and better fit for the low-income country context. So I think AI is exciting both for improving forecasting overall, but specifically in improving forecasting in places where it's historically lagged behind, because you no longer need this massive resource of supercomputers and scientists. You can now do this at much lower cost, which means that this type of forecasting is hopefully going to become accessible to countries around the world that haven't had access.
Yeah, I mean, the gap between what we get in the wealthier countries compared to lower income. I mean, yesterday, as I was embarking out for my evening here in London, my Apple weather app said it was raining for 5 minutes and it'll stop in 11 minutes. And it was pretty accurate. So I was like, I guess I'll not bring an umbrella. Imagine if smallholder farmers had anything resembling that in India, where the livelihoods are on that line instead of just, a little bit of wet hair. Speaking of big tech companies, though, I understand that your research, you've partnered with Google. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how that can help scale the work?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, one place that's very exciting about this work is matching innovations that are happening on the academic side with the people who are really pushing the frontier on the computer science and the AI side, which is, of course, the big tech companies, right? Academics in CS are doing great work, but they're kind of a small corner of the world. Really, the kind of the frontier of this research is being done in the big tech firms. And so the way that the AI forecast was chosen this year was actually our team went and vetted a bunch of different candidate AI models. One from the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecasting that ended up being a pretty high quality one, and then the one from Google NVIDIA. Okay, and so there were a bunch of testing and benchmarking, because of course an important piece of this is when we're handing out in partnership with the government forecasting information, we want that information to be as accurate as possible. But here is a place where bringing the big tech into the endeavor allowed us to produce many more of these model runs and ultimately produce kind of the most accurate forecast possible, tweaked for this particular application.
So working with tech companies, is that something you've done in the past, or would you say that's new along with the AI application?
Yeah, this is brand new. I think it's new for the research team, and it's an exciting opportunity. I think thing that makes this the most exciting is when you go from doing something as one or two academics in a small research lab to partnering with big tech firm, you could think about scale in a whole new way, right? Again, as I was describing, when we ran our initial experiment, we were thinking about 250 villages. A couple of years later, we're now sending forecasts to 40 million farmers. That's just not completely possible by us working in the lab on our own. And so partnering with tech firms, partnering with governments to try and get this message both optimized and then out the door, I think is the future of this work.
So what's the reach for? Is it something where, like farmers in Africa, I'm sure they deal with this challenge too. Like, what's the goal? If you could snap your fingers and make it happen.
I mean, everywhere, everything, right? That's the ultimate target. I think, you want to do this in a way that's responsible. So the reason we started in India was because we felt like the forecasting technology was good enough to feel comfortable handing that out. The initial scaling step was to go from a couple hundred villages to a full state, then from the full state to a broader range. We're not quite at the whole country yet, because what you want to do is make sure the forecast is really accurate. And so Northwest India is going to look a little bit different in terms of the forecasting model that's required than the Southeast. And so we want to make sure that we're kind of vetting the model of providing farmers with the most accurate information. So that's kind of the next step, is like across the country of India, but then also around the world. Now, of course, doing that requires a different model in different places, right? So the rainfall patterns and how those translate into agricultural productivity are going to look different in, say, Chile or in Rwanda that they do in India. And this is one also kind of additionally really important piece of this work, where the partnership between the academic team or the economists and the computer science folks on the team has been valuable, is that on the weather forecasting side, there's been a huge amount of effort put into predicting things that physicists care about. And that's great, and it helps us to learn about the climate system, but the thing that the physicists cared about is often something like, up 2,000 meters, what does the wind speed look like, and then what does the radiative forcing look like in this kind of small corner of the world? Now that turns out to not always be super correlated with the experience the farmer has on the ground. So the kind of innovation that came from our side of the shop was, hey, let's design these forecasts in a way that they are beneficial to the decisions that real humans are actually making. In addition to learning new things about how the climate works, we can also tell people the information that they need to make their decisions. One thing that we're not doing that I think is also kind of worth flagging quickly is we are not telling a farmer, here's what you should plant, or here's when you should start the growing season. We're just telling you, here's when the monsoon rate is going to arrive. Why is that? Because the farmer knows way better than me how to handle that information, okay? And so what we're trying to do in this kind of broad suite of projects is to provide the information that farmers need at really low cost without then overstepping and bringing this like, well, in the US, the way you would interact with this information is thing X, Y, and Z, because we trust the farmers to have their own local expertise. They're missing the information, but if they have the information, they can do great things with it.
Another reason to focus on India is, and why UChicago does a lot of research there, is that it's the largest country in the world with it's the biggest, most populated country in the world. And that's where everything's happening in terms of climate change in particular. And so I want to stay in India, but shift to a different topic that also is very close to home for farmers, which is insurance. Can you talk about sort of at a high level what this research is and what you hope to get out of it?
Yeah, so in a kind of separate set of projects, we've been trying to understand the potential costs and benefits of expanding crop insurance across India farmers. So historically, when you look in low-income countries, access to insurance on the open market has been very, very limited, okay? That's for a large number of reasons. My pet reason is basically, what does an insurance contract look like? I show up at your door, I say, pay me £50 today, and then in 3 months, if you have a bad year, I'll come back with 200. In a world where court enforcement of contracts is pretty limited, there's a good chance that you'll never see that person again, right? So you can imagine that if I don't have the ability to formally enforce contracts, insurance turns into a really difficult thing to provide. There are other...
That's your assumption for why there's no insurance.
I think part of the work that sort of suggests that the insurance market has faced challenges. There are, of course, other ones. So credit constraints are a big one. When you are asked by an insurance company to make an upfront premium payment, that's at the same time that you're investing in seeds and fertilizer and all this other stuff, and you just don't have very much cash on hand as a farmer, and getting a bank loan is very costly too. So there's a number of reasons why there's been limited access to formal insurance provided on the private market. And, another thing with agriculture is that it tends to be fairly different to insure. Why? Because when I have a rainfall shock, that is to say there's a drought in my village, hey, my neighbor in my village also has the same drought and has the same crop failure, right? So we have what we would call a correlated risk, which is to say that the insurance company is paying a lot of us out at the same time, which can tend to be expensive for them and kind of a one-shot go. Of course, if the insurance company is able to survive over multiple years, you have some good years for the company and some bad years for the company, and that smooths itself out. But if they also have limited access to capital, that can sometimes be a problem. So all that to say,
and of course, there's agriculture insurance here, or not here, but in the United States, where I normally look at. So it's obviously not impossible to do. It's another one of those examples where lower income countries are getting the short straw.
But even in the U.S., we don't do that fully on the private market, right? So the
US government
spends billions and billions of dollars annually subsidizing farmers. Part of the reason for that is up until recently, tariffs were a bad word. I hear that's no longer true. But in order to avoid upsetting our friends at the WTO, a major way we've done agricultural support in the U.S. is through subsidies to the crop insurance program rather than trying to do price supports at the other end. Which is to say that even in a super wealthy country with a really well-developed market and agricultural system, you still need government investment to end up with a sort of large share of farmers having access to insurance. Now take this back to India, where that private market has essentially collapsed. Then there are questions of, well, should the government step in, and what would happen if it does? In some parts of the country, and increasingly expanding, what started to happen is actually the government is stepping in and offering to provide insurance at incredibly low cost, couple of cents per hectare, where the reason that there's a price is because they want you to sign a contract, so there's a piece of paper formally recording the contract. But beyond that, you really have a very, very low cost for this insurance, and the idea is that if you have a flood or a drought or pests eat your crop or other crop failure, the government will then kind of step in and come and bail you out. The research we're interested in undertaking then is, as you have this massive expansion of the insurance program on the government side, to what extent does that prevent farmers from investing in their own private adaptation technology? Okay, so here's the idea. If I know that the government is going to come and give me a large insurance payout at the end of the year for my crop bills, maybe I take less care to try and plant things that are flood tolerant or drought resistant, and instead I just plant whatever would be the highest value because I know that I'm going to get a payout at the end of the day. And the reason that's potentially a challenge is because the government is going so far to make the insurance very cheap, right? If the insurance market could function effectively privately, what we want to see is farmers making some combination of purchases of insurance as well as private adaptation technology. But once you start having the government coming in and making the insurance entirely free, then you start to worry that, hey, maybe farmers are actually taking on too much risk, and now that's shifting risk onto the government system. That's the good jumping off point for the project that we've been working on, which is a randomized control trial where we provide some farmers with insurance and others with no insurance, and we're trying to understand to what extent does that affect their decisions to invest in private adaptation. And here I finally have a piece of good news, which is that it looks like it doesn't. Farmers are just as interested in investing in things that keep their crops protected, the flood-tolerant seeds being a key example of this, when they have access to that government insurance and when they don't. So what this means is we get a win-win. The government helps protect farmers. It allows them to continue taking on what we think of as reasonable risks, but at the same time, farmers are aware that they are still subject to some climate risk, and so they're going to be taking the private actions as well. So we're thinking we're getting a pretty good combination of public investment as well as private side investment, which is ultimately what we'd like to see.
When can we expect some final research out on that?
So the project has been in the field for 2 years. We are doing the end-line survey starting, I think, tomorrow. So hopefully this coming spring, we'll have a paper out highlighting those results.
That's great. Well, we'll all stay tuned. Let's travel to California now, a little bit closer to our homes anyway, in the US. So I understand you're doing some research on groundwater. Why there, and what are you studying?
Yeah, so the reason to think about groundwater is it's one of our natural resources that is really under threat, both in general and under climate change. Why do I say in general? Well, the vast majority of the world's groundwater stocks are not being actively managed, which is to say that if you are a farmer, or anybody really, but we're going to be focused on agriculture here, and you have a plot of land that sits on top of a groundwater aquifer, you are allowed to go and, as we like to say in the US, drill, baby, drill, extract as much water out of the underground system as you want. Of course, that means that when I extract a gallon of water today or a liter of water today, that means there's one fewer liter in the ground for all of the rest of you to extract tomorrow. But because I'm a ruthless profit maximizer as a farmer, I'm not paying attention to those costs. This is a classic common pool resource problem and suggests we're probably extracting the aquifers faster than we would otherwise be. There's now starting to be a sort of spate of policies put in place to think about reversing that trend. So instead of pulling way more water out of the ground than is returned to the aquifer by the rainfall and snowpack and a natural system, California has recently put into place a policy called the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SGMA, with the goal of getting these aquifers into what they call natural sustainability by the 2040s. Natural sustainability here means that there is as much water going back into the aquifer every year as farmers are pulling out. So the policy landscape in California makes this an interesting place to study. It's also a useful place to think about these types of trade-offs between agricultural production and groundwater costs, because the agricultural land in California is some of the world's most valuable. The state produces almost 20% of total US crop value, and all the things that we love to eat, like strawberries and almonds and this type of thing.
Drink almond milk, of course.
Yeah.
Almond milk might end up being the X factor here, right?
That's right. So one big thing that we wanted to understand in this study was, if you were to kind of tax groundwater or impose some kind of policy that restricts farmers' access to groundwater, what would happen? Okay, and the upshot of that study is in some sense good news and in some sense potentially concerning news. So the good news is it does actually look like farmers would respond to a groundwater policy by changing their use of water. That is, if you make the water more expensive, they do in fact back off of it, which gives us hope that these policies that the state is putting in place might have some chance of actually reducing the speed at which we take water out of the aquifer. But of course, that doesn't come for free. So then the other question is, how are farmers achieving these water savings? They're going to be doing that in a couple of different ways. One is actually just exiting agriculture altogether. So we see a kind of decent increase in fallowed land. Were you to put a tax on groundwater that's kind of equivalent to the size you would need to achieve this overall aquifer sustainability. And then the reason Amy is talking about almonds is another thing that you see is farmers kind of pulling land out of these really water intensive but high value crops like almonds or like oranges, and instead shifting to annual crops that are a little less valuable on the margin but also use a lot less water. So I think in some sense this is a good news story. Again, you can take a situation where we're just really dramatically over extracting the resource. You can put a policy in place to try and address that, and that policy does look like it's going to work. At the same time, we want to then think about what are the consequences of that on our food system. I think one way to think about this is that the almonds that we're eating right now are actually much cheaper than they should be because the price you see at the store doesn't actually incorporate the costs of the water. If you were to add on that price, you would see farmers growing a little bit fewer almonds because it's just much more expensive than they're kind of currently paying for.
And the almond milk might be much more expensive at the store. It raises the question of what can individuals do? And so I want to get to the audience questions here in just a moment, so be thinking of that. This is your 2-minute warning. In the meantime, Fiona, talk to me about, a lot of your research focuses on systemic changes, obviously, but we're all seeing here as individual humans on this planet where we make decisions about what we do, whether it's to buy almond milk or eat a hamburger, maybe 3 in one day for some people. I grew up on a cattle ranch, so I have eaten a lot of beef in my lifetime. What can individuals do when the problems to solve climate change are so systemic?
Yeah, so I think at the end of the day, the way that I think about this question is if we make climate change adaptation or climate change mitigation very, very expensive, demand slopes down, there's not going to be that much interest in purchasing that adaptation or purchasing that mitigation. That means that I think the most effective things that individuals can do is actually help invest in policy. And why do I think policy is the right solution here? Because it really is large-scale government-style intervention that has the ability to lead to low-cost improvements. Okay, so one really nice example, not necessarily on climate change, but that I can sort of share with you from some of my colleagues' work, is thinking about using markets to address pollution. Why do economists love markets so much? It's because they deliver really effective, sort of large reductions in pollution, but also at extremely low costs. Okay, so with some recent work done by my colleagues who put an emissions trading market, put a market for pollution in place in India, they found dramatic reductions in the cost of controlling pollution compared to a group that was under the standard command and control regulation. So it would be lovely if I were sitting here and tell us all, like, let's go ahead and buy an EV, let's switch our food consumption to sort of a more vegetarian diet, let's do more recycling. Those things can make a difference on the margin, but really where these changes are going to come from is switching the energy system from coal to wind, or broadly putting in place carbon taxes that actually incentivize people at large scale to change their behavior. I'd love to sit here and say that, you know, each of us can do our part, but I actually think that really the way to address this problem is to go and lobby your policymakers to put cost-effective climate policy in place, because if we're just doing things that are very expensive, that means we're just not going to do as much as we should. That also means, as a little plug for the academic side of this, right, doing some careful work to understand which policies are cost-effective and which are cost ineffective. So it's one thing that a policy works. Yes, maybe I can get improvements in climate outcomes from installing like a bunch of energy efficiency in buildings. But if I'm doing that for $2,000 a ton, where instead I can invest in a cook stove in sub-Saharan Africa for $12 a ton, I would love many, many more of those $12 a ton investments, and I think large-scale policy is the way to get there. So we need a combination of push for policy as well as push for research to understand what works and what doesn't work to get us to effective solutions.
And in flagging your comments is this idea that if we don't have policy helping lower prices, we'll have really expensive prices, and then we'll have politics and boycotts and strikes. I think the first thing that would happen if farmers were taxed is there would be a riot in the U.S. Congress. And so that's why policy matters as well. And I know we're not talking about politics, but it's a good thing to call the elephant out in the room now and again. And with that, would love to throw it out to questions in the audience. We have a couple of mic runners. So please, we have a gentleman in the back. Sure. And please state your name as well.
Altabado Thomas, undergraduate 7 to 9, currently at the Oxford Institute for Islamic Studies. I want to address a different elephant that you brought up earlier, which you ran away from. The role of the global north in funding change in the global south. And I've been active in the last 2 weeks engaging with African leaders who are now the panic mode is over. That was up until June. They're now saying there is no America. It's gone with his money. England is next. France is after that. Maybe Scandinavia will remain. So all future adaptation has to come from our pockets. How do we help? Yeah. And then a footnote, do pollution markets really work given the Varus sample?
Just a few small things there, Fiona, for you to tackle. I think we can do it in the next 5 minutes. Why don't we take the first one and then his footnote question as well.
Yeah, great. So on what the global north can do, I think there are kind of 2 pieces of this, right? One is I think they sort of go together. I guess the broad answer here, I think, is we need to recognize that the only way that we are going to make substantial progress on the climate change problem is to involve the global south. And in fact, she centered them as leaders in addressing the challenge. Like, this is not something that England or France or the Netherlands, even if they wanted to, could solve on their own. So that means kind of increasing reliance on the global south. Potentially some good news here is actually China is emerging as a climate leader. Why is that? Partly because climate damages are going to be felt in China, but actually another big reason for this is China turns out to be a massive innovator and huge producer of solar panels and would love to sell that to countries all around the world, right? So that's actually a nice opportunity for a country that's considered part of global south, but increasingly growing, to help invest in climate technology. I think the easiest thing for the global north to do is to continue to do R&D and do technology transfer. So I develop better solar panels, I develop better energy efficiency, I develop better wind farms, and I can help spread that technology around the world. If we invest in research here, there are benefits that accrue to everyone, not just people in the UK or the US. But another part of this is, of course, continuing, this goes back to my policy point, continuing to make sure that policymakers understand that improving climate change outcomes in the global south is a good deal for us in the global north, right? This isn't a problem we could solve on our own. If we want these challenges to be addressed, we really need to cooperate with our neighbors. And we can think about doing that in ways that involve sticks. We can think about it doing that in ways that involve carrots, right? A stick that's being currently discussed is the EU CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which essentially says if you would like to import a ton of steel into the country in a way that's been from a place where that ton of steel is produced using a lot of carbon, I'm going to tax the carbon content at the border. And that's a trade policy that essentially imposes a carbon tax on an external country. So that's a stick approach. You can also think about more carrot types of approaches, like producing a climate fund that helps low-income countries either invest in their own technology or improves resiliency in low-income countries in exchange for doing some additional mitigation.
I also think it's important to say that there was the second part of the question as well. Do you want to address that? I wasn't entirely sure what he was saying, but I thought maybe you might know.
This is not a context I'm super familiar with. What I will say is on the kind of effectiveness of pollution markets, I think an important piece of this, and this came out of my colleague's work, is that kind of effective monitoring is kind of step one to being able to run a carbon market properly. So what my colleagues went and did was worked with Indian regulators in the state of Gujarat to install a large amount of pollution monitoring equipment in farms, and then they were able to use that equipment to actually enable the pollution market to happen. If you don't have the data and you don't have kind of good oversight over the market, of course, nothing is going to work. So I'm happy to talk offline about this particular set of issues, but I think the broad point here is that sort of investments in monitoring technology and investments in effective regulation are, of course, going to be an important part of getting markets to work as well as they should for all of us.
And an addendum to the gentleman's question on, why caring about lower income countries with climate change is so important. I think this, again, is a little bit outside of our wheelhouse tonight, but is the geopolitical impacts of increased migration because of climate impacts. And so that's the whole reason why there was foreign aid infrastructure in the United States. And of course, for a lot of reasons, that has gone away. But I think, unfortunately, it will come. It's just a matter of time until extreme weather forces it back onto the agenda. More questions from the audience? Yes, the lady in the back. Yeah.
Hi, Millie Falnikov, MBA 2011. I actually lead clean energy research for one of the centers at Imperial College London. And one of the things you mentioned is related to carbon schemes, both carbon taxes and emission trading schemes. Given that most jurisdictions don't currently have one, what do you kind of see is this evolution? Where do you see some pockets of optimism in terms of some jurisdictions that don't currently have them that you think could adopt in the next several years?
Yeah, so here's, I think, actually another opportunity for some optimism. If you look over the last 10 years and then project into the next 10 years, we're actually seeing dramatic growth in the number of countries that have pricing mechanisms for carbon. The US is clearly not on the forefront of this, but our neighbors to north in Canada have made substantial advances. The EU with the EU ETS, South Africa, China has an initial step at that, and has promised to make a more intensive version going forward. So I actually think there's a lot of progress there. And what's nice about that is the more countries put a pricing mechanism in place that has this kind of knock-on effect, because as soon as I have a carbon price, that makes my own domestic production less competitive than our neighbors that don't have a carbon price in place. And so now you have a natural reason to add a carbon-based tariff, right? And as soon as I impose a carbon-based tariff on my neighbor, well, hey, now they face an additional incentive to clean up their act as well. So I think we're getting to a place where there's actually quite a lot of momentum on carbon pricing. We in the US are no longer the shining beacon that we maybe once were on some of these climate mitigation issues, but I actually think that sort of around the world there's opportunities for optimism here. At the recent COP in Brazil, there was a lot of conversation actually led by a Brazilian coalition thinking about these carbon border adjustment mechanisms, and I think having that come out of Brazil, which is historically been, I think, a place with some challenges getting on board with the climate mitigation agenda, is a really exciting look forward. So yes, we're in some dark times, but I actually think on this front, there's progress being made.
Thank you. Great. A couple more questions from the audience. You have two in the middle, and then the gentleman up in the front row.
Hi, my name is Tala. I'm actually a PhD student. I just have a question for you for the India project that you had. You mentioned that the farmers were desperate and, obviously going for an astrologist to tell them these things, they would be desperate. But you made that kind of experiment on that. Have you actually tried to see their behavior or their acceptance, their willingness? Because obviously they really wanted something to happen, and because they're low-income countries, their lives literally depend on that. But in countries that were say the UK or even the US, does that actually work, AI forecasting or something like that? Because I think it's not really, that effective, or farmers don't really take it into consideration, because again, their behavior or their willingness there to adopt new things, it's not, I think, the same as low-income countries or farmers in low-income countries. I don't know if it makes any sense.
Yeah, so I actually will push back on the premise of that question a little bit, because my understanding of farmers in the US is actually they're some of the most sophisticated firms in the world, right? That is not, of course, going to be true for every mom and pop smallholder farmer, but overwhelmingly the industry is run by large-scale agribusiness. We can talk about pros and cons of that, but I think one pro is you have people who are really heavily invested in optimizing that agricultural production as much as they possibly can. And actually, a good reason to do this work in India rather than in the US is because the US is up but miles ahead. Farmers are already using very, very advanced forecasts. And as I was saying, the forecasting technology in the US is already much better. So I actually think farmers are already incorporating it. A reason you might see smaller effects if you were to try and run a similar experiment in the US is because they already have access to that information. So I think it's less about kind of willingness to try a new thing. I think actually these sophisticated profit maximizing firms are very excited about trying new things that will make their business more effective. And it's more about where are the biggest opportunities in terms of technology gap, information gap that we can try and think about helping generate improvements.
Okay, the gentleman right behind her, got a question as well. While the mic is getting to him, I'll also say that this is something I actually mentioned to Micah Breenstone, the head of the institute, in our debrief on the podcast episode on this call. But I grew up on a cattle ranch in Washington State, and we had 3 cows that died from a surprise frost that came late in the winter. And if we somehow had AI that could have told us those cows were going to die earlier than we wanted them to, that would have saved us thousands and thousands of dollars. So I think there's always ways to improve, even if farming and matching operations are already very tech savvy. So that's just no example of hopefully the ways AI can save us in the future.
Yeah, maybe on that note, so Mike Rosenberg, undergraduate 2003, run an energy startup. Was one curious if you could double click a bit more on your insights and experience on the technology curve. So I'm familiar with Google's Neural GCM model, 4 to 6 week kind of longitude prediction, but you also mentioned on this emissions trading that your colleagues that they're responsible on ground sensors. Was there like an insight that farmers should be incentivized to host on the ground sensors with a few days extra warning, richer model, or kind of lead to demonstrable benefits? Could this be gamified, or but basically, how can we go beyond the south of temperature?
Yeah, so I think here the biggest gains are actually like there's enormous amount of weather station data that it's just not being used incredibly effectively. So yes, I think there are potential like additional improvements to be made on microclimate, and especially like variability of precipitation, for example, depends on really local information. But that's actually one step more advanced than the current problem is, which is to say that I think there's big gains just by bringing the AI models onto the existing weather station data, and I think you could definitely go further. As well, as part of some of our research, we've done things like install local flood gauges and things like that, and that's actually proven to be doable with very little, fairly small incentives. Farmers are actually pretty interested in the measurements themselves. So I think there are ways to get additional data sets out there. The challenge is really in thinking about, how high quality do you need the measurement to be? Right? When we're thinking about pollution, for example, like the pollution monitors that are used in the Environmental Protection Agency's work are these like tens of thousands of about hundreds of thousands of dollar installations. Now, we can all have a like $50 pollution monitor in our backpack. Do we want to rely on the $50 one? There's some benefits and some costs to that. So I think the benefits are increased resolution. The costs are potentially slightly decreased accuracy, and there's a trade-off. But I think in general, data technology is getting much cheaper, and it has potentially lots of different benefits.
Okay, time for one, maybe two quick questions. I think we had a question here at the front row.
Hi, good evening. My name is Andre Pauwels, MBA from 1988. And I actually have a farming background. My parents were farmers, grandparents were farmers, and before that were all farmers. I was a bit shocked by what you mentioned in the beginning. I believe you mentioned that agricultural production is dropping by 4% per year.
Per degree Celsius increase in warming, not per year.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Still bad, not quite that.
I misunderstood because I thought you mentioned that by 2010, 2000 or 2100, agricultural production would be 40% of what it is currently.
Sorry. There are projected losses in the most productive areas currently of approximately 40% kind of by end of century, with things left unmitigated. Those gaps shrink to on the order of 20% if you incorporate farmer adaptation into the story. So definitely that. Okay, why is that? Well, it turns out that in major crops, so corn or maize is the big example of this, if you write down a graph of how corn responds to different temperatures and try and do this your direction, as things get warmer and warmer, you get an increase in production, but then you have a really precipitous decline once you get past like 35 degrees C. And so as we start to push these growing areas into the right of that curve, you see these extremely large drop-offs. So those kind of pre-climate change, and even without doing a projection, like at the local level, you get yield declines of 5 to 10% per day of temperature at the extremes, 38, 40. And so we're just seeing many more of those days, which drives these losses.
I see. So your 4% was linked to 1% of decrease in temperature. Because, while you were saying that, I did some AI research, and it actually claimed that agricultural production was increasing every year, but that the increase in agricultural production is dropping. So the percentage increase is still increasing every year, but the percentage increase, based on what I read on AI, is dropping because of whatever reason.
Yes, I think that's been true up to this point, but as you start to go further and further towards end of the century, things warm so much that we again start to get to kind of more and more vulnerable crops. I guess one other thing I'll say is that in the US at least, there's been a lot of work that suggests that the same innovations in crop technology that have allowed us to have greater and greater yields have also come with a downside, which is those really, really high yielding varieties are also actually much more climate sensitive than their predecessors 20 years ago. So yes, the average is going up, but also our exposure on the extreme ends is getting much worse, and we're getting more and more of those extreme days, so you get this big drop off as well.
We have time for one very quick question over here, Laura.
I don't know if it's going to be quick, but my name is Maitri, and I unfortunately am not part of the university, but have been invited here as a guest. So it's just a curiosity question. When we're talking about using AI for predictions, how are you balancing the climate demands of AI when you're talking about helping people suffering the consequences in what you call low-income countries? And the second bit is, how safe are the farmers' data in India right now? Because that is a market that American companies have been looking at for a very long time to open up. So that data is valuable, and it's understandable that you're excited about it for a pilot project. So if you could give me clarification on those two, that would be great.
Yeah, definitely. So I think my answer to your first point is basically my answer to everything, which is like, let's price the externality correctly, right? So if we do, in fact, put a price on the carbon that we use or the water that we use to power the AI model, then we will do a good job balancing the benefits and costs, right? My hunch is that, look, these forecasts are relatively low cost to produce, even with the AI model, and deliver massive benefits. So that's probably a use case where, even counting the AI costs, the benefits wildly exceed the costs. My late night ChatGPT on like, what TV show should I watch tomorrow? Can't be not the right, that kind of decision point, right? So I do think getting the prices right helps us make these decisions real large. The second question on data, yes, of course, this is always a hot button issue, is thinking about privacy and data. I think one, for better or for worse, I think a lot of farmer data is already accessible because you can see a lot of what's going on with just satellites. So I don't often actually need necessarily individual farmer information to learn everything. Of course, you can learn much more detailed information by going and conducting surveys, and so that's kind of what my team and I do, and we're subject to all sorts of university privacy regulations. I do think there are questions about what is the right way to share that data that doesn't compromise the farmers themselves, but I think one answer is better access to this type of data in the hands of researchers potentially generates enormous multiplier benefits, but we also can do that in a way that's not kind of harming individual farmers on the ground. That's a tricky thing to balance.
In our final moments together, I want to play what I call a concluding game of Would You Rather. It'll take just a few minutes. It's the most fun part of the whole evening, I promise you. Are you ready, Fiona? Let's do it. Okay. Would you rather have a hypothesis that you then prove widely right or wrong?
So all of our statistical machinery is to falsify things. We never confirm our own hypotheses. We just tell ourselves that our previous selves were wrong.
So you choose wrong, and she's wrong. Would you rather always rely on AI or never rely on AI?
Never. I think we're still at the point where there's enough human judgment required that I'm not willing to give my whole brain to the computer just yet.
But maybe at 5 or 10 years. Yeah, or 5 or 10 minutes. Would you rather live in a world where coffee is climate proof or where chocolate is climate?
The gloomy. That's very difficult. I'm gonna have to go coffee, but just barely.
Would you rather live in Seattle or Lebanon?
Lemon. Sorry, and me.
I'm a Seattleite, so would you rather live in London or Chicago?
Don't let my wife hear. Probably London.
Well, we're here. We won't tell anybody. Would you rather always know the weather perfectly or never have to check it because it's always pleasant?
Always know perfectly. I do appreciate the Californian beautiful climate all the time, but I've come to appreciate some variety as well.
And our final question for the night. Would you rather change the past or see the future?
Oh, see the future.
Well, with that, I want to thank Fiona and hand it over to Lauren for some concluding remarks.